Powder River Basin, Wyoming. October 1901. The wind had already stripped the cottonwoods bare, leaving their silver skeletons to scratch at a sky the color of dishwater. On a low rise overlooking a frozen creek, Halvard Nygaard was building something that made no sense. He was not building a cabin, at least not in any way the other settlers understood. He had spent the late summer with his two sons, Leif and young Astrid, hauling fieldstone and setting a foundation. But it wasn't a foundation for a house. It was a low-walled, half-buried rectangle of stone built into the south-facing slope of the hill, like a root cellar. It was a byre, a shelter for cattle, and a sturdy one at that. Now upon this stone box, he was laying massive timber joists, framing not a hayloft, but a home. Burl Stemmons, the county assessor, pulled his buggy to a stop, his horse steaming in the cold air. Beside him sat Jebediah Crane, a man who had built more cabins in Johnson County than anyone and considered himself an authority on the subject. They watched for a long moment as Halvard, a quiet man of immense physical strength, hoisted a beam into place. "What in God's name is he doing, Burl?" Crane finally asked, his voice a gravelly mix of disbelief and professional offense. "Is he building his house on top of his cowshed?" Stemmons squinted, his assessor's mind already calculating the absurdity. "Looks that way, Jeb. Looks like the damnedest piece of foolishness I've seen since that fella tried to irrigate with canvas buckets." They got out and walked over, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. Halvard saw them coming but didn't stop his work. He set the beam, checked it with a plumb bob, and only then turned to face them. "Nygaard," Stemmons began, skipping any pleasantry, "this is your registered homestead plot. You filed intent to build a family dwelling." "I am," Halvard said. His English was sparse, shaped by the hard consonants of his native Norwegian. Crane let out a short, sharp laugh. "A dwelling? On top of a barn? Halvard, the weight of the snows will collapse the whole thing. And the stink. Your wife will be breathing cow manure all winter. It's madness." He pointed a thick finger at the structure. "You can't put a family in a hayloft." "It is not a hayloft," Halvard said calmly, turning back to his work. Stemmons stepped closer, his tone hardening with official authority. "Listen to me, Nygaard. A structure is classified by its primary use. If it houses livestock, it's a barn. You can't live in a barn. It's a sanitation hazard. I'll have to reclassify the whole plot as agricultural, not residential. You'll lose your homestead status." He shook his head, a gesture of finality. "Tear this down. Build a proper cabin on the ground like a sensible man." Halvard paused, his gaze fixed on the distant Bighorn Mountains. He looked at the two men, their faces pinched with cold and certainty. He looked at the half-finished structure, a strange two-storied thing that defied every convention of the frontier. Then he simply picked up his adze and went back to shaping the next joist. The mockery would last through the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. What did this Norwegian fjord farmer, a man from a land of steep rock and deep water, understand about the fundamental physics of radiant heat that the most experienced builders in Wyoming, men who had survived dozens of brutal winters, had completely missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the past, to the innovators who used observation and ingenuity to solve life or death problems. If you believe that the best ideas are often the ones that get laughed at first, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss a single story. I promise you will learn not just about history, but about the timeless principles of science that govern our survival. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Halvard Nygaard was not a frontiersman. He was not a carpenter or a rancher in the Wyoming sense. In his homeland of Norway, he had been a farmer, but farming there was a different art. He was a man of the fjord, a life lived on a vertical plane between the immense pressure of the sea and the crushing weight of the mountains. He understood stone, water, and the patient, life-giving heat of animals. He knew that in a place where timber was scarce and winter was a 9-month siege of darkness, survival depended not on fighting the cold, but on harvesting every scrap of warmth the world offered. He had come to America with his wife Solveig, and their 2 children, Leif, then 10, and Astrid, 6, drawn by the promise of flat, open land. The Powder River Basin offered land in abundance, but its generosity ended there. Their first winter, in 1900, had been a lesson in humility, a brutal education in the failures of conventional wisdom. They had built a standard cabin, just as Jebediah Crane would have advised. A single room of green pine logs, chinked with mud and grass. It had a large stone fireplace, the pride of the frontier home, which consumed a staggering amount of wood. They had spent that autumn cutting and splitting, creating a woodpile that seemed impossibly large. It was gone by January. The failures were specific and terrifying. The great fireplace, meant to be the heart of the home, was its greatest weakness. The massive draft it required to draw smoke up the chimney also drew in Arctic air through every crack and seam in the walls. The family huddled close to the flames, their fronts roasting while their backs froze. At night, the fire would die down, and the temperature would plummet. The cabin didn't hold heat. It merely rented it for a few hours at the cost of a forest. That winter, the cold was so profound and persistent that a column of ice formed inside the chimney. One morning, the smoke from the breakfast fire, unable to escape, poured back into the room, choking them. Halvard had to scramble onto the roof in a blizzard, chipping away at the flue ice with a hammer, his hands freezing to the metal. Worse was the moisture. Their own breath, the steam from the kettle, condensed on the frigid interior walls. It formed a delicate, crystalline lattice of frost that glittered in the lamplight. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. During the day it would melt slightly, and the walls would weep, the water running down the logs and soaking their bedding, their clothes, their sacks of flour. The flour stiffened into a hard, unusable cake. Everything they owned was damp and cold. Solveig developed a persistent cough that rattled in her chest, and young Astrid was perpetually sick. They survived, but Halvard knew they would not survive another winter like that. He had failed his family. The American way of building was wrong for this place. It was a strategy of brute force, and the winter was a force that could not be beaten by muscle alone. The problem wasn't a lack of wood. The problem was a failure of physics. A standard Wyoming cabin in 1901 was a thermal sieve. The primary building material was logs, typically lodgepole pine. A 6-inch thick pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 7. For comparison, a modern insulated wall is R19 or higher. The chinking, a mix of mud, clay, and dried grass, was even worse. It would shrink and crack as it dried, opening up dozens of small fissures. The real enemy was air infiltration. A roaring fire in a large hearth could draw over 200 cubic feet of air per minute up the chimney. That air had to come from somewhere. It came from outside, whistling through the gaps in the chinking, under the door, and around the window frames. This constant influx of supercooled air, often at temperatures of -20 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, meant the occupants were living in a constant, invisible river of cold. They weren't heating a room. They were attempting to heat the entire state of Wyoming as it passed through their house. The Miller family, Halvard's nearest neighbors a mile down the creek, were living this failure in real time. They had a larger cabin than Halvard's first one, but it suffered from the same afflictions. Mary Beth Miller told Solveig they were burning through a cord of wood every 10 days, an unsustainable rate. Her husband and 2 teenage sons spent every daylight hour that wasn't devoted to tending stock, felling, and bucking trees. Their lives had been reduced to the singular, exhausting task of feeding the fire. Even so, their cabin was never truly warm. They slept in their coats, and the water bucket by the door was perpetually skinned with ice. The relentless labor and the suffocating cold were wearing them down physically and spiritually. The conventional design also ignored the principle of thermal mass. The log walls and wooden floors had very little capacity to store heat. When the fire died, the heat radiated away into the night almost instantly. There was no thermal battery, no reserve of warmth to carry them through the long, frigid nights. The settlers were trapped in a cycle of furious effort for temporary comfort. Halvard watched this cycle of waste and suffering, and knew there had to be a different way. The solution wasn't a bigger fire. The solution was a better design, one that captured and stored a source of heat that his neighbors were ignoring completely. Halvard's new home rose from the ground with a logic that was entirely foreign to the landscape. The foundation, the byre, was the key. He dug it 4 feet into the south-facing slope, using the earth itself as insulation on 3 sides. The walls were 2 feet thick, made of carefully fitted fieldstone, not mortared logs. Stone possessed immense thermal mass. It would absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. The west wall, which faced the prevailing winter wind, had no windows or doors. The only entrance to the byre was a large, insulated door on the sheltered east side. Upon this stone foundation, he built the house. The floor joists were not the typical 2x8s, but massive 6x10 timbers, spaced 3 feet apart. He was building for strength, anticipating not just snow load, but the weight of a family and their lives. The walls of the living quarters were framed, not solid log, allowing for a cavity he planned to insulate with a mixture of sawdust and dried moss, a technique he had seen used on fishing boats. But the floor was the most radical element. He used thick, 2-inch oak planks, a precious expense he'd paid for by selling 2 of his best oxen. But he didn't lay them edge to edge. He left a deliberate, uniform gap of 1/4 inch between each plank. Burl Stemmons returned in November, just as Halvard was finishing the roof. The structure now looked even more bizarre, a proper wooden house sitting strangely high off the ground on its stone pedestal. Stemmons walked around it, his lips a thin line of disapproval. He found Halvard inside, fitting the final floor planks. The assessor ran his hand over the gapped floor. "Nygard, I warned you. This is not a proper floor." "What is the meaning of this?" "For the heat," Halvard said, not looking up. "The heat? You'll have drafts coming up from your cattle that will freeze you solid. And the smell. I can't permit this." Stemmons pulled a notepad from his coat. "I'm giving you official notice. This ain't a dwelling, Nygard. It's a barn with a loft. I'll have to classify it as such. It's a sanitation hazard. You cannot raise children over an open manure pit." Halvard finally stopped his work and stood up. He was a foot taller than the assessor. He looked at Stemmons, his face unreadable. "The air moves up," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The waste moves down." He pointed to the floor of the byre below, which he had graded to a central gutter that drained to the outside. "Cleaned every day. Straw is dry." Stemmons was unmoved. "It's unsanitary and it's unsafe. I'm filing the reclassification tomorrow. You have 30 days to appeal or comply." He stormed out, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn fool who was endangering his own family. Solveig stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Halvard, the assessor, he can take the land?" "He does not understand," Halvard said, turning back to his work. "The winter will teach him." The physics Burl Stemmons failed to grasp was simple. but profound. He saw 40 head of cattle as a source of filth. Halvard Nygaard saw them as 40 slow-burning, self-regulating furnaces. An average 1,200-pound cow has a resting metabolic rate that generates a significant amount of heat. The precise number varies, but a conservative estimate is around 1,000 British thermal units, or BTUs, per hour. A BTU is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It is the fundamental currency of heat. Halvard owned 40 head of Hereford cattle. When sheltered together in the stone byre, their collective heat output was staggering. 40 cattle, each producing 1,000 BTU per hour, meant a constant 24-hour-a-day heat source of 40,000 British thermal units per hour. To put that number in perspective, a typical wood-burning stove of the era might produce 30,000 to 70,000 British thermal units per hour, but only when it was burning at full blaze. It required a constant supply of fuel, and much of its heat went straight up the chimney. The cattle, on the other hand, were a source of passive, radiant heat. They didn't require stoking or a flue. Their warmth was a simple byproduct of their existence. The heat they produced wasn't primarily convective, meaning it didn't just warm the air around them, which would then rise. A significant portion of it was radiant heat, infrared energy that travels in straight lines and warms any object it strikes. The slatted oak floor was designed to be the receiver of this energy. The heat radiated upwards, warming the thick planks. The planks, in turn, radiated that heat into the living space above. The quarter-inch gaps allowed for slow, gentle convection, ensuring a constant, silent circulation of air, but they were too small to create a noticeable draft. This system was also self-regulating. In colder weather, the cattle would huddle closer together, concentrating their heat output. The stone walls of the byre acted as an enormous thermal battery. They would absorb the excess heat from the animals and the sun hitting the south-facing exterior, and then slowly release it back into the space during the coldest parts of the night. The sanitation concern, while legitimate on its face, was based on a misunderstanding of the design. The gentle upward movement of warm air created a pressure differential that prevented the heavier, foul-smelling gases, like ammonia and methane, from rising into the living quarters. Halvard's daily mucking out and use of thick, dry straw bedding kept the byre clean and minimized odors. He had designed a living, breathing system where biology and physics worked in concert. The mockery he faced was the tax paid by an elegant, misunderstood solution in a world accustomed to brute force. That December, the winter arrived not as a gentle slide into dormancy, but as an invasion. A sustained norther, a brutal mass of Arctic air, descended upon the high plains and refused to leave. For 24 consecutive days, the temperature in the Powder River Basin never rose above -20 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plunged to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that drove the cold into every living thing. The frontier, for all its ruggedness, began to break. The miller's well froze solid, forcing them to melt snow for water, a task that consumed even more of their precious firewood. Silas Croft, a rancher with a large conventional barn, lost a dozen head of cattle. They didn't starve. They froze to death standing up, their bodies discovered like ice sculptures in the morning gloom. The sound of axes echoed constantly through the frozen air, a frantic, desperate percussion against the unyielding cold. But inside Halvard Nygaard's strange house, a different reality prevailed. The relentless wind shrieked around the stone and timber, but inside there was a profound stillness. There was no draft. The small cook stove in the corner was used only for preparing meals. Its warmth was a welcome bonus, not a necessity for survival. The primary source of heat was a silent, gentle presence from below. The floor was warm to the touch, not hot, but a steady, life-affirming warmth that permeated the entire space. Leif and Astrid could play on the floor in their stocking feet, something unthinkable in any other house in the county. Solveig sat in her rocking chair, mending a shirt by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her fingers nimble and warm. She no longer had to huddle over a fire. Her cough had vanished. The only sound was the gentle, living rumble from beneath their feet, the soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of hay, the shifting of heavy bodies. It was not the sound of a barn. It was the sound of a living engine, a slow, steady heartbeat that held the killing cold at bay. One afternoon, Solveig was churning butter. The warmth in the room was so consistent that the cream turned quickly. She set a freshly molded block of butter on a plate on the floor near the wall, intending to move it to the cold box later. She forgot about it. Hours later, it was still there, a perfect, soft rectangle, neither melting nor hardening. It was a small, domestic miracle, a testament to a comfort so complete it had become normal. Outside, the world was freezing. Inside, life went on, warm and undisturbed. The contrast was absolute. By the third week of the deep freeze, Burl Stemmons was under pressure. The community was gripped by a mixture of fear and suspicion. Rumors flew that the Nygaard family was freezing to death in their foolish cow house. Others, like Silas Croft, who had lost cattle, whispered that the structure was a breeding ground for disease that could sicken the whole valley's livestock. Stemmons, seeing his authority questioned and his dire predictions about to be tested, decided to act. He would not go alone. He needed an unimpeachable witness. He drove his sleigh to the small office of Dr. Angus Arbuckle, the county physician. Dr. Arbuckle was a man of science, respected for his methodical approach and his lack of patience for gossip. "Angus, I need you to come with me out to the Nygaard place," Stemmons said, stamping the snow from his boots. "I believe the family is in danger. Living over livestock in this cold, it's a recipe for pneumonia, if not worse. I need you to document the conditions. Your word will be enough to have them removed for their own safety and condemn the structure." "Doctor?" Arbuckle raised an eyebrow but agreed. An hour later, they pulled up to the two-story cabin. It looked almost serene in the frozen landscape. No plume of desperate wood smoke belching from a chimney, only a thin wisp from the cook stove pipe. The silence was unnerving. They knocked. The door was opened by Halvard. He simply nodded and stepped aside to let them in. The two men entered, braced for the expected shock of frigid, foul air. The vindication was not a shout. It was a wave of sensation. What Stemmons expected was a blast of cold, the familiar, damp chill of a failing cabin, mixed with the sharp stink of manure. What he felt instead was calm, a steady, even warmth that wrapped around him like a woolen blanket. There was no smell of livestock, only the faint, pleasant scent of baking bread and warm wood. Dr. Arbuckle, a man trained in observation, began his work immediately. He unbuttoned his greatcoat, then his suit jacket. Stemmons, still bundled in his winter clothes, began to sweat. The doctor examined the children, who were sitting at a small table drawing on a slate. Their cheeks were rosy, their breathing clear. He walked the perimeter of the room, his hand trailing along the walls. They were dry. There was no weeping frost, no trace of damp. He then knelt down, his movements precise. He placed his bare palm flat against one of the oak floor planks. He held it there for a full minute, his eyes closed. Stemmons watched, bewildered. "Burl," the doctor said quietly, his voice filled with a strange wonder. "Feel this." Hesitantly, Stemmons removed a glove and knelt beside him, placing his own hand on the floor. It was warm, a deep, penetrating warmth that felt alive. He looked up at Halvard, his certainty beginning to shatter. Dr. Arbuckle stood up. "Mrs. Nygaard," he said to Solveig, "may I trouble you for a knife and a small plate of your butter?" Solveig, confused but compliant, brought them over. The doctor took a pat of the soft, yellow butter and placed it directly onto the floor plank where his hand had been. They all watched. The butter did not melt into a puddle, but it did not harden into a frozen chip, as it would have on any other floor in Wyoming that February. It simply sat there, perfectly soft, yielding to the slightest touch. It was the ultimate proof, a simple, undeniable demonstration of thermal equilibrium. The doctor took out a pocket thermometer. He laid it on the floor. After 5 minutes, he picked it up and held it to the lantern light. 61 degrees Fahrenheit, he announced. He turned to Stemmons, whose face was a mask of disbelief. I find no violation here, Burl. On the contrary, I find this to be the healthiest and most sensibly constructed dwelling I have had the pleasure of visiting all winter. There is no smoke, minimal dust, and a stable, healthy temperature. Stemmons stared at the soft pat of butter, then at the Norwegian farmer who had endured his scorn. The entire foundation of his frontier expertise, of what he knew to be right and true about survival, had just been demolished by a silent man and a piece of butter. He finally looked at Halvard, his expression a mixture of awe and profound respect. My God, Nygaard, Stemmons said, his voice barely a whisper. You didn't build a house on a barn. You built a house on a furnace. Dr. Arbuckle was a man transformed by evidence. He saw in Halvard's design not just a clever trick, but a public health breakthrough for a region plagued by respiratory illnesses born of damp, smoky, and cold-infested cabins. He returned to his office and spent the evening composing a detailed letter. It was not addressed to the county commissioners, but to the Agricultural Extension Service at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. In his precise scientific prose, he documented his visit. He included the exterior and interior temperatures, the dimensions of the structure, the number of livestock, and the complete absence of frost or dampness. He described the butter experiment with the enthusiasm of a researcher detailing a successful trial. He concluded his letter with a powerful statement. Mr. Nygaard has demonstrated a principle of thermal efficiency that, if adopted, could significantly reduce fuel consumption, improve the health of our rural population, and decrease winter livestock losses. He is not a madman. He is an engineer of the highest practical order. The letter landed on the desk of an extension agent named Elias Thorne, a man dedicated to finding and promoting practical solutions for the state's farmers and ranchers. Intrigued, Thorne made the 2-day journey to the Powder River Basin the following month. He spent a full day with Halvard, taking meticulous notes, drawing diagrams, and asking questions not about construction, but about airflow, thermal mass, and animal husbandry. That spring, the University of Wyoming published an official bulletin titled The Buyer Stack Method, a study in thermal efficiency using livestock. It was distributed to ranchers and homesteaders across the state. The bulletin, dry and technical as it was, gave Halvard's radical idea the one thing it needed to overcome social mockery: institutional legitimacy. The spread was not immediate, but it was steady. That autumn, 4 families, 2 in Johnson County, and 2 more over the mountains in Sheridan County, built modified versions of the Nygaard house. They were not exact copies, but they all shared the core principle: a well-insulated living space situated directly above a sheltered livestock enclosure. The following winter was a mild one, but the results were still dramatic. Families reported cutting their firewood consumption by over 70%. Their homes were warmer, drier, and healthier. The idea, born of ancient Norwegian necessity and proven on the Wyoming frontier, had begun to take root. Burl Stemmons, once the loudest critic, became its most fervent advocate, advising new settlers on how to properly site and construct their own Nygaard cabins. Halvard Nygaard's cabin over Buyer was more than just a clever design. It was a physical embodiment of a principle that modern building science would not fully embrace for another 70 years. It was, in essence, a biological passive house. Modern passive house standards focus on 5 key areas: extreme airtightness, super insulation, high-performance windows, thermal bridge-free construction, and some form of energy recovery ventilation. Halvard's design, using the materials at hand, anticipated at least 3 of these. His stone byre, dug into the earth, provided insulation and a massive thermal battery. His insulated wall cavities were a primitive but effective form of super insulation. Most importantly, his system recognized the value of internal heat gains. Today, building designers meticulously calculate the heat produced by occupants, appliances, and lighting to reduce the load on mechanical heating systems. Halvard did the same, but his internal heat source wasn't a television set and a refrigerator. It was 40 head of cattle, producing 40,000 BTU per hour. He created a symbiotic structure where the needs of the family and the needs of the livestock were perfectly integrated. The cattle provided heat for the humans. The humans provided a well-built shelter that protected the cattle from the wind, dramatically increasing their winter survival rate. It was a closed loop of energy and life, a century ahead of its time. The shrewdest warmth costs no wood. It costs only the patience to listen to what you already own. The American frontier, in its rush to conquer a continent, often celebrated a philosophy of extraction and brute force. If you were cold, you cut down more trees. If the soil was poor, you moved on. It was a mindset of consumption. Halvard Nygaard brought with him a different wisdom, one born from a land that offered no surplus. It was a wisdom of observation. He looked at his assets not as separate commodities, but as parts of an interconnected system. The cow was not just meat and milk, it was a living furnace. The earth was not just dirt to be plowed, it was a blanket against the wind. The sun was not just light, it was a free and limitless source of energy to be stored in stone. He never sought recognition. He never argued with his critics. He simply built what he knew to be true and let the unforgiving reality of a Wyoming winter serve as the final judge. His neighbors, in their desperate, endless labor to feed the fire, were fighting the winter. Halvard Nygaard, in his quiet, methodical way, had simply used the life he already possessed to create a pocket of summer and live inside it. He proved that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not found in adding more effort, but in seeing the hidden connections that lie right beneath our feet. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and thermal physics as fascinating as we did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every subscription helps us to uncover and share more stories of forgotten genius. For our next discussion, we'd love to know, what modern technologies do you think are simply rediscoveries of ancient principles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The story presented is a fictionalized historical reconstruction inspired by real historical practices and principles. Names, characters, and specific events have been created for narrative effect. The building techniques described are historical and may not conform to modern building codes, safety standards, or regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice. Any application of these concepts should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and ensuring compliance with all current laws and safety guidelines.